So welcome back, everyone, and to our friends online as well. Welcome to the broadcast. Session 2 will deal with airlines and innovation. And as I mentioned earlier, this afternoon we'll have the airport perspective. But right now we'll focus on the airlines. And over the next few minutes, we'll actually share in the outcome of a recent IATA workshop of the future of air transport security, titled Air Transport Security 2040 and Beyond. That will be part of the discussion this morning. And that two-day event actually brought together some 80 experts from across the industry to debate and discuss a vision for air transport security in the future. So it should be quite interesting. Our moderator for the session is Michael Woodall, Principal Security Consulting and Capacity Development at IATA Consulting. A few words about Mike. He joined IATA on secondment from the UK Department for Transport in January 2013, having spent the previous 2 years crafting UK, EU, and ICAO regulatory tests in response to the aviation security cargo bomb plot of October 2010. We all remember, of course, that event. During his initial 2 years with IATA, he successfully oversaw the creation of the IATA Center for Excellence for Independent Validators and the formal accreditation of the IATA Independent Validator Training Course by many European states. He also led a successful global information and awareness campaign to assist carriers, ground handlers, regulated agencies, known consignors, shippers, and many state entities to implement the new inbound EU air cargo security relations he helped bring into force. Michael is then extremely well positioned to lead our expert panel this morning. Michael, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. I'm really pleased to have with me a really informative and interesting group of presenters this morning to share their knowledge, expertise, and information with you. We're hoping that this will be interactive. So for those of you that have the app, and hopefully everyone has the app, please do start putting in questions as quickly as you have them. We have a program for you this morning, which we hope you will find interesting. No? Kirsty?
Try backwards. It's a cyber demonstration.
Thank you. So we hope you're going to find the next hour and a half or so informative and interesting. You can see the speakers on the screen. I'm not going to go through a lengthy explanation of who they are. I'm sure most of them are already very well known to you. Some of them have already spoken during this event. I'm going to pass you now over to Matthew Vaughan. He's the Director of IATA Security, and he's going to give you a bit of information around airlines innovation and what our agenda for today looks like.
Thanks, Mike. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for your time this morning. We understand that there are a number of different activities taking place at the same time, so thanks for your time to come into the room and have a listen to us over the next 1 hour? 1 hour, I think?
83 minutes
83
and 11
minutes.
seconds.
83 minutes, okay, so strap on, right? Okay. And I wanted to kind of just set the tone on this panel and give you some of the wave tops in terms of security and what IATA is embarking upon every year, but also strategically in the way that we see protective security protect the promise of growth that is currently being forecasted. And I think in the current climate, September 2019, it's really important to start off on a really good, strong foot, and that is that air transport, specifically for scheduled aviation, has never been more safe than what it is today. And despite the challenges that we see at the moment with the MAX 737 aircraft, and the frequency of the Annex 17 amendments that are changing, aviation remains safe and secure. And that's got to be a key message here this morning to continue to drive home. So if that is the case, then what's left to do? And strategically for us, it's about protecting and securing that growth that we're forecasting over the next 20 years. And it's not just about operational security, right? It's about protecting the promise that this growth brings. Because if you don't address being able to strategically position security as an enabler to this growth, what you will see is stagnating economic development, which then leads to threat multipliers, which can then also lead to terrorism against successful industries like aviation. And so when we look forward in terms of that 20 years that IATA is forecasting, probably a no-brainer. It's probably really simple for everyone to see in this illustration that the forecasted growth compared to where we are today starts in Africa, Central Asia, and then Far East Asia. And so therefore, as we plan going forward as security professionals, we need to be mindful of what those threat multipliers may mean in these parts of the world. And of course, infrastructure, training, capability, security agencies' capabilities, they are all mainstay issues that we face today and are most likely going to continue to be that as we see this growth taking place. So what's IATA doing about it? We have established a 10-point strategy where safety and security is number one. Number one to IATA and number one to its member airlines. And it's also quite unique to say that in that number one safety and security commitment is aviation cybersecurity. And so arguably that could be three different priorities, but today it's just one priority. And we have developed a plan that will go with it that is structured around advocacy, standard setting, services and products. So from January 2020, you will see the way that IATA operates and facilitates and engages industry and government will be through the prism of these three key enablers to what we see going forward to support that growth. And then when you see the top 10 priorities put together in how we structure our effort, safety and security is about committing to that promise to grow, that license to grow. And then creating a platform thereafter and then driving into airline capabilities. So as you see this presentation here this morning and the content that we're going to drive into and drill into, it is about protecting that strategic growth. And with that, I'll hand back over to Mike. Thank you.
Thank you, Matthew. I'm going to spend some time talking to you about air transport security from a sort of 2040 and beyond perspective. So recently, IATA held a 2.5-day brainstorming session. 80 individuals from a really broad and diverse spectrum of the industry, from academia, from governments, from regulators, airlines, ground handlers, a really broad church of really interesting, vocal, passionate, innovative thinkers came together in Brussels to spend 2.5 days with a big sheet of blank paper, seriously considering what does 2040 look like? What are the threats? What are the challenges? What are the potential mitigation strategies that we all need to adopt? What will the industry be facing in 2040? Now, clearly that's a big crystal ball, and that's a pretty big challenge. And there were some diverse opinions. We don't all agree on what the threats will look like in 2040. We don't all agree on what the mitigation strategies would look like. But there were some strong common themes that fell from that piece of work. And that piece of work will hopefully develop into a white paper, and that will be published, and all of these thoughts in detail will be shared with you. But what we wanted to do was to take a bit of time to share with you some of the outputs from that activity. So we did this blue skies thinking piece of work. The workshops were held in Brussels at Eurocontrol, and Eurocontrol very kindly hosted the event and put on the facilities. And that was in June, so not that far away. And it was around building capacity, improving efficiency, and driving optimization. So some of that is around how do we improve security checkpoints, how do we drive innovation, what are the challenges, what are the mitigation strategies. And as you can clearly see on this visual, and falling away from Matthew's recent visual, about where we see the movement of goods, services, and passengers, where we see that dynamic changing across the industry in the next 20 or so years. And on the whole, the workshop felt that there were two potentially different scenarios that could play out in the next 20 years. There's what we called seamless. So this is a sort of far more optimistic and hopeful view of where we would be in 20 years' time, where we treat passengers in a far more personalized way. We're using big data, we're using their personal preferences, we're using technology, be that in the form of an app or whatever the system is in 20 years' time, to try to provide a more personalized level of service. And that personalization could also include the deployment of security protocols based on an individual's biometrics, based upon their historical travel patterns, based upon a load of big data that helps us treat them and react to them as an individual. We would hope that security as a result would largely be less intrusive, so almost non-intrusive. And again, in the presentation earlier this morning, we were seeing some technological enhancements that allow people to go through advanced image technology, body scanners, etc., in a more seamless walking maneuver rather than stop and search. And we thought it would be heavily tech supported. And again, what that tech looks like, and whether that's personalized tech, whether that's security tech, screening tech, whether it's tech that enables the industry on a grand scale, we weren't entirely sure, but we thought tech would definitely grow and support the business. And we thought, hopefully, this seamless structure would have to be integrated. People would have to come together, systems would have to come together, states, governments, regulators, the industry would have to come together and create an integrated, seamless structure. The less optimistic felt that we could potentially be driven down a more siloed route. We would continue to treat passengers as anonymous objects. They wouldn't be personalized. The structures wouldn't be personalized. We would still be doing all things to all people wherever we felt that was possible or even necessary. The less optimistic was saying, yes, it would still continue to be a slower process. And that would be slower in terms of process, but also security, how people were moving through the system, how they were processed in terms of transit or transfer passengers, and this also applies to catering and cargo and lots of other activities. And it would be far less enabling. And that may be driven by threat, and it may be driven by individual regulators taking an individual, less integrated approach. So there were two relatively different views and relatively different perspectives coming through. The collective overall view was that hopefully we would move down the seamless route. Hopefully we would be able to continue to integrate, continue to apply non-intrusive technologies, continue to apply big technology and a more personalized approach. But collectively, these 80 people over 2.5 days also highlighted what they saw as potential issues. And these fell into 5 relatively broad categories. Terrorism. The collectively held view was that terrorism isn't going to go away. The old threats will probably remain, some of them will evolve, and new threats will continue to emerge. So what they will be, how they will manifest themselves, and how we will look to react to them could be different for different people at different times in different locations. But the big terrorism threat that was of real interest was potentially around activism. And is activism a form of terrorism? Or is activism a different issue, a different pot of concern and consideration? Is activism that dramatically impacts on aviation performance and the free movement of people and the ability of us as an industry and as collective regulated entities to allow aviation to grow and flourish, is activism a form of terrorism? And is activism directly targeted at aviation specifically because the activists disagree with aviation and they see it as a primary target that they wish to physically or indirectly attack? Or is aviation a byproduct, an innocent bystander of a bigger issue, a bigger collective activism agenda? And we've seen around the world different activists having disproportionate impacts on an entire airport, on individual airline operations. We've seen activism from large-scale organized groups down to single individuals refusing to allow our aircraft to take off because they disagree with, for example, the deportation passengers sitting on board the same aircraft they're on. So this activism can take place landside, it can take place airside. It doesn't necessarily need to be disruptive or destructive. These people aren't necessarily breaking through fences. They have a perfectly legitimate right to be on the aircraft because they have a boarding pass. So activism and terrorism, potentially two very interesting and potentially intertwined threats moving forward that we would need to keep an eye on. And then the group looked at technology. Will technology keep pace with the threat? Will technology enable us moving forward in a positive way? Or is it always going to be behind the curve? Is it going to be behind that cycle of performance improvement that we're all looking for? And that's in relation to security, but also in relation to passenger facilitation, how we use big data and how big data helps to drive the business. And then the environment itself. So whether we do or don't believe in global warming, we can all see that extreme weather patterns are increasingly obvious from the international news. Does the environment itself start to pose a hazard to aviation? Or is aviation, and we come back to activism, is aviation itself being perceived, rightly or wrongly, to pose an environmental challenge? And again, how do these issues all come together? How do we use activism, terrorism, and environment to best effect? And then we come to data. So there's going to be more of it. There's definitely going to be a lot more of it. How do we process it? How do we handle it? How does that data and how we use that data evolve? Is it seamless? Is it integrated? Is it working for us? Or is it in effect a threat? Is it working against us? Is the cyber threat, because of the huge volumes of data, itself a bigger issue? Or is the sheer volume and quantity of data the problem? And then as regulation around data protection and individual personal responsibility, how does that impact on what we would like to do as an industry in terms of passenger facilitation and free movement? So then the group started to look at potential mitigation strategies. And again, these fell into 5 pots. There's a lot more detail, obviously, over the 2.5 days, but in broad terms, these are the 5 mitigation strategies that the group, the collective, felt really need to be pushed between now and 2040. We really need to improve our ability to be agile, to be nimble, to have the speed and the willingness and the integrated thoughts and communication channels that allow all of us at an industry level and at a regulatory state level to adapt and respond and assimilate to threat and vulnerability information. So we need a collective capability that enables us to conduct and agree and enact a risk assessment that drives a proportionate and realistic response, but only for as long as that proportionate and realistic response is required. So we need to be able to turn it on, but equally we need to be able to turn it off in a very quick, nimble, and agile process. And to do that, particularly if we're going to do that cross-border, we need to build trust. And that has to be cross-border inter-organizational trust. We need states to accept increasingly, and carriers to accept increasingly, that others' risk assessments and others' data and others' views and opinions and others' actions are trustworthy, that they help to educate the bigger picture and the bigger decision makers. And we need to bridge gaps. Now, one of those gaps may be a trust gap, but it also is around capacity. And that's capacity in lots of different areas. It's not just about training. It's not just about turning that training wheel to keep passing forward that capacity knowledge around what is a good service, what is a good level of security, what is a good perimeter fence. It's about people, but it's also about knowledge, technology. It's about building confidence, driving improvements in process and capability and capacity within organizations, across organizations, and critically across borders. And that leads us to technology. Because if the super advanced states or the super advanced parts of the industry, be they airports or airlines, have the top end technology, what happens to the people slightly further back with the slightly less new, shiny, up-to-date technology? And what do we do about the technology that's right at the back of the queue? At what point do we start to grandfather some of this older technology and take it out of the system? And what point do we all collectively agree that an old-fashioned archway metal detector is no longer a commonly accepted baseline standard? So how do we optimize technology moving forward? And one of our speakers later on this panel will have some thoughts on that. And people. At the end of the day, people are still our biggest asset. They're still our biggest investment in terms of time and effort and trust and a capability to have eyes and ears and to pick up on issues and symptoms and potential problems that others systematically or process-driven may not identify. We still have to invest in our people. And again, how we do that and how we innovatively invest in our people and help our people to become better tomorrow than they are today is a key challenge. So these are the two main areas that fell out of these 2.5 days of really interactive workshops. Some really interesting thoughts around what the threats and the situations would be in the next 20 years, and some very interesting thoughts around what the mitigation strategies would be. And very briefly, before I hand on, I just want to highlight that there was also another differential across the groups: age. And I look around us, and we're all more or less in a sort of ballpark age group. The millennials in the group, and if we jump even further ahead, the Generation Z people who were in this workshop have a very, very different view to the vast majority of people who are having these conversations. When we were putting up graphs and working on the basis that there will continue to be an increase in passenger numbers, as Matthew showed in his graph, the Generation Z people were saying, I'm not sure I buy into that. I'm not sure that my generation are going to want to continually travel around the world. I'm not sure that my generation want to fly on a regular basis. I'm not sure this will be a continual increase. They're sitting there in the group and they're saying, we're not really materialistic. We're not sure we want stuff shipped around the world. I'm quite happy to eat locally homegrown produce on a seasonal basis. I don't need the latest tech gadgets anymore. I'm more interested in experiences than I am in possessions. And the millennials and the Generation Z had a very different view to the majority of people in the room. And I think that's something that we collectively need to take on board. If you look at the US, Generation Z, those born sort of just before or immediately after the year 2000, currently make up 25% of the US population. So what Generation Z think, how they react to challenges, for example, around environment, will be a big driver for aviation moving forward. So I just leave that with you before we move on to my next speaker, because we've got lots of issues. We've got a lot of ideas we want to share with you, and I want you to hear from them and a little less from me. So at this point, I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Adam. Thank you, Adam. Adam's going to take us through our next section.
Thank you, Mike. Good morning, everyone. The topic that I wanted to cover, creating a little bit of a context for Jared, who is going to give you the airline perspective, is an aspect that's related to the agility component of the IATA strategy, and it's related to
Last point.
to something that was already discussed throughout all these days, and it's how we use data to inform risk assessments. So the slide that you see here is a very typical process of security reporting, and I know many of you have been probably discussing the implementation of the recent Annex 17 standard 516, but this process has been in place for airlines for some time now. But we keep on trying to understand how this process can, at the end of the day, inform our risk assessment. And to do that, we realized that there is a necessity to put in place quite important enabler, quite important element at the beginning, so that we can actually try to improve that risk assessment. And that element is harmonization of security taxonomy. So the whole concept of security reporting has been in place for several years now for IATA member airlines and for IOSA certified airlines. For those of you who are not absolutely familiar with IATA processes, IATA runs the Operational Safety Audit Program. That's an auditing program for airlines. Not only, it's a prerequisite to be a member of IATA, but the program is open also for all the other airlines. And that program covers also the security component. So the standard on security reporting has been there already for several years. And over time, and as airlines are collecting data, we start to get more input from airlines and realize that there is a need to start to speak that harmonized language, because that's an enabler for further innovation in the process, just to make the risk assessment more informed, just to respond to, as Matthew mentioned, to respond to vulnerabilities, to respond to threats in a more dynamic fashion, in a more flexible fashion, and so we can use our resources to the best possible extent. So as you see on this timeline, it's been already more than 2 years that we've been engaging with interested member states, with industry stakeholders, with other partners, with international organizations. So there is ICAO here, and we've been presenting our concepts starting in 2017. And I think where we are right now is, first of all, it became just the part of our day-to-day work streams. And second of all, we of course, we don't feel like we've covered everything through that taxonomy, but at least within the core aspects, within the core topics, we got to the point where we feel pretty comfortable we may speak in a harmonized language. So if we use the term aircraft access control and we have reports about aircraft access control, generally speaking, we understand what's behind the term. And that opens up a whole range of different possibilities for faster exchange of information, for sharing information between airlines with different industry stakeholders, and also with international partners and organizations. So there's a little bit more around practical activities and practical solutions that we developed. We included that in the IATA SEMS manual. There is a proposal at the IATA public website that includes the template form for security reporting for entities that may need it because perhaps they haven't have resources to develop something on their own or in-house or through subcontractors. So I just invite you to have a look at our SEMS website. And for more practical applications, I guess I'll just hand over to Jared to give you a little bit more of the real consequences and implications of future solutions. Thank you.
Thanks, Adam. Good morning, everybody. I think it's a really great follow on what Adam said in terms of taxonomy and how we approach some of the future issues and future challenges that we're going to encounter. If we look at what the forecast for air travel is going to be, whether we're looking at a pessimistic or an optimistic side, determinant upon whether we have a shift from globalization or a stronger protectionism agenda, either way, we're going to see significant forecast growth, and that's what we're expected to see. An important part about how we contextualize some of the challenges or threats that'll evolve for us is what we do with data reporting and data analysis. Historically speaking, some of the challenges that we've encountered as an airline for security reporting and security reports and analyzing some of that data is how we measure it, how we take that information without specific categories, contextualize it, and determine vulnerabilities from what we're seeing. We're stuck doing free text analysis. It becomes quite hard to measure. We have difficulties in categorizing some of the trends. And where we need to shift to in terms of data analysis is determining what we need to do with those reports and how we take that input and create a valuable output. We see an increase in reporting. It's hard to be able to determine whether that's a tangible increase on incidents that are occurring, increased passenger volume, or just a stronger, enhanced security culture. If we can take the new taxonomy or a standardized taxonomy, and like Adam had said, where we understand what each one of those categories or subcategories is, then we can start to evolve and do better data analysis, and that will give us better capabilities to do an identification of new vulnerabilities. And that's an important part of what we do with the new taxonomy. From a security culture perspective, it's really important, obviously, that we're engaging with some of our external contractors, and where we see less reporting isn't necessarily from the enhanced culture that we have internally, but it stems from some of the difficulties we have with external contractors ensuring that they're on board with what we need to be able to assess and analyze, and understanding what the processes and the procedures are that they need to accomplish. In terms of assessing what we need to be able to do for threats, using those contractors will be really, really crucial, and then be able to identify how we be able to measure what impacts of security are, and means in terms of either an SLA or security service levels, we'll be able to facilitate a better impact or a better understanding of what our security contractors are doing and reporting. We need to be cognizant that standard threats aren't going away. Knives, guns, IEDs, low sophistication attacks remain critical for us to be aware of. There's emerging technologies, there's a growing reliance upon cyber. There's emerging threats which are equivalent with opportunities that also come to the industry. Drones, autonomous vehicles, and biometric collection are just as much enablers of growth as they are detractors in terms of the threats and the vulnerabilities that they bring to us. The growth, as we're starting to see in the markets that are more challenging, where we start to see it in South Africa, or at least Central Africa and Central Asia, those are going to be markets that have significant passenger volumes, significant populations, and it requires the demand for structured innovation and infrastructure. How do we cope with that increase in passenger traffic? And last, we have a tendency to focus on current compliance with regulations. However, regulations can take some time to reflect the awareness of new vulnerabilities, and that leads to evolving threats that can be overlooked. So how do we as an industry shift from being reactive to proactive? We have to encourage and advocate government to shift to a risk and outcome-based regulatory standard. We need to work with states to evolve regulatory instruments and remove redundant or obsolete measures. We need to develop procedures and policies that are adaptive and responsive to new innovation and technology. And the evolution of security awareness training. People are our strongest asset. However, as computers do more, human skills erode. And we need to maintain a position on top of that. We need to maintain the capability to react quickly and appropriately in crisis conditions. And recognizing that aviation will always remain a high-value target, and conventional civil battlefields, especially as we start to see now for activism, have been shown to spill into the aviation atmosphere. Thinking like an attacker, not as a defender. The cyber domain is a really good example of that, where we have white hatters versus black hatters. And being able to understand and identify vulnerabilities or risks that are coming and emerging to our industry as we tackle this growth is something that will be really valuable for us. And shifting our focus from experiences to scenarios. Instead of adding another checkpoint, which might add a new vulnerability, what would happen if the scenario were different? And these are what we need to be able to consider as we start looking at what the evolving threat atmosphere will be and how we address innovation and growth. We need to advance risk assessments. We need to have discrete and decentralized security screening and offer personalized experiences. From an airline's perspective, we don't want to end up in a siloed neighborhood. We want to be able to have a personalized experience that's enabled across multiple nations and across borders. We'll enhance our risk awareness and our assessments. We'll focus on enhancing security culture and human capacity through technology, working towards technological resources and fostering innovation, and continued oversight and quality control. Increased cooperation across industry and state, and that's what we will be able to do to help us drive towards 2040 and making sure that we're responsive to appropriate threats.
Thank you, Jared. Before we move on to Sarah, people are already putting questions through. This is fantastic, but we're always open to more questions. So we are going to have time for a lively, interactive debate. So please do keep using the app. Please do keep sending those questions through. Thank you. So over to Sarah.
Thank you. Just waiting. Yeah, okay. So I would like to give a bit of a different perspective again, I guess, and present some research that the research group I'm working in has recently done, and kind of go into the mitigation strategy of better utilization of people that Mike has introduced at the beginning. Before I start, I would like to introduce to you a bit how what the perspective of automation, human factors, and technology is that our research group has. And as you know, there's processes, there's technology in aviation security, and there's the human factor. And what we're trying to do is really to connect all of these three factors and to see it as a holistic human-machine system, and also see it as a socio-technical system, and try to connect these factors to get the best results, to get effective and efficient security at airports. So today I would like to talk about the impact of new imaging technologies like 2D multiview, dual view technology, but also 3D CT technology. And to go also a bit into processes, I would like to also present to you some results that we have from a study with automation and human-machine interaction in X-ray screening. Before I come to these results, I would like to talk a bit about challenges of X-ray screening. I personally think it is a very, very difficult task, and people don't always understand why it is such a difficult task. So I have 3 X-ray images of bags here that are just 2D or simple 2D X-ray images. And what screeners face for challenges in especially cabin baggage screening is that they have many prohibited items to detect. There's a large variety of prohibited items that all of the screeners need to know how they look like in X-ray images, and so on. So many objects also look very different in X-ray images, and screeners still need to recognize them. There's also some very unfamiliar objects that they need to recognize in an X-ray image, like this self-defense gas spray, that you need to know how this looks like in real life, but also in an X-ray image. Or there might be everyday objects that just look very different in an X-ray image than in real life, like this electroshock taser that we would probably all recognize as a picture, but not necessarily in an X-ray image. There's also a difficulty that some prohibited items just look like everyday objects. I will come to that later a bit. And then there's also difficulties that prohibited items, when they are not shown from a very familiar view or rotation. When a gun, for example, is rotated in the back, as it is on the far left picture, the gun is suddenly not very recognizable, or it's harder to recognize this gun. There's also a scissor in this luggage on the far left, so you can see for yourself if you find the scissor and the gun in this bag. Another difficulty is when objects are superimposed by other objects. You probably also know this. So if there's a lot of other objects, if there's a very cluttered bag, and there's different objects overlaid over the fret object, it gets way harder to recognize the fret. So what can we do to face these challenges? There's on one hand, for sure, training. For those of you that were also here yesterday, I've said that before, and we all agreed on it, that training is very important still. And it is important because, as I said, screeners need to learn which items are prohibited and what they look like in an X-ray image. Then there's, of course, different varieties of training. There's coaching sessions, there's live work, there's computer-based training. And what we have found in studies is that computer-based training, computer-based simulators has been shown to be very effective and in achieving a good detection performance, but also maintain it. On this graph from a study that we published in 2013, you can see that, well, on the x-axis you see the training hours, on the y-axis you see detection performance, and you can see that 50 hours of training really increase performance. So up to 50 hours of training, we still have an increase in performance. After 50 hours of training, we can just maintain training performance. But it is still important to keep on training to really maintain this performance. If we're not training our screener on a regular basis after these 50 hours, the performance is decreasing. So training is one thing that we can do. Then there's certainly technology. We also talked about technology before. Mike said it as well. Technology is improving. We know that. So I would also like to show you a few studies that we've done with new technology. I start with Multiview technology, which is not so new anymore. As you can also see, this publication that was already published 10 years ago, where we considered, or where we tried to see what's the benefits of multiview technology. Multiview technology just means that you have more than one view of a bag. In the back on top, you can see a single view image, which shows one view. And then on the bottom, you see the same bag again, but you see also on the right side, a side view of the same bag. And as I have it illustrated here, you can see that when images or threads are rotated in the main view, it can be that in the side view, you suddenly see it from a much more familiar view, like this knife, and you can recognize it better. So this was also shown in the study. In the graph, as you can see, performance or detection performance with multi-view technology in red was better than with single-view technology, especially when threads were rotated in a difficult position or superimposed by other objects. So this is certainly good news. What multi-view technology also features or can feature is explosives detection. If you have heard the talk yesterday from Steve Bacall from Rapiscan, EDS CB, explosive detection systems for cabin baggage screening is coming. Multi-view technology can reach, depending on which system you use, C1 or C2 standards. And what EDS CB does is that it marks areas that might contain explosive material. So in this picture, you can see there is one frame on each view. and it just shows there could be explosive material. In some countries, and now we come a bit to the processes, in some countries, screeners are allowed to conduct on-screen alarm resolution, which means the screener sees this image, it sees, the screener also sees the frame, and then has to decide if this frame is actually a threat or if it's a false alarm. In other countries, OSAR is not allowed yet maybe, and bags with EDS CB alarms are always sent to secondary search. The screener has no decision in that. So what's the difficulty with on-screen alarm resolution? As I said at the beginning, some prohibited items can look very similar as harmless objects. And this is especially the case for just bare explosive material. In this bag, you can see 3 alarms that were alarms from EDS CB, and only one of them is actually an explosive, namely alarm 1. But you can see alarm 2, alarm 3 do not really look very different. Alarm 3, for example, is a tennis ball, and it's an orange object, just as alarm 1. There's no diagnostic visual features that you can differentiate these 2 orange objects, basically. So this can be a problem, and we've recently conducted a study where we tried to figure out how screeners react to different EDS CB algorithms. We tested, I think it was 120 screeners from a European airport, and they all conducted this test. One group, the gray group, did not have any automation assistance. The blue group, EDS CB1 group, had support from an EDS CB system, which had a hit rate of 86% and a false alarm rate of 20%. So a very high hit rate, but also a very high false alarm rate. The EDS CB2 algorithm had a hit rate of 60%, so a lower false alarm rate, but it also a lower hit rate, but also a lower false alarm rate of 5%. And the EDS CB3 scenario had a hit rate of 21.5% and a false alarm rate of 5%. So what we tried to do with this EDS CB3 algorithm was to kind of implement a risk-based scenario. So the orange algorithm is basically the blue one, the first one, but it was only activated for a quarter of the bag. So if you would take flight risk information, if you would take passenger information, and according to that information, only use the EDS CB algorithm on a quarter of the bags by random variation or this risk-based information. So what did we find in the study? On the x-axis, you see the categories we tested. We tested guns, we tested IEDs and bare explosives. And on the y-axis, you see the hit rate of these categories. And as you can see, the good news is guns were not affected by EDS CB. Why is this good news? Well, there are some concerns that if EDS CB is on, if on-screen alarm resolution is done, that then screener won't look for other objects anymore, or if there's see no frame, if they see nothing else, they will be distracted or whatsoever and don't detect guns anymore, or knives or other objects. But as you can see, the detection of guns was not affected in any group. When we look at IEDs, we can see that EDS CB was beneficial. All 3 algorithms did have a better detection performance than the gray group of no automation. And what I should also mention, the dashed lines that you can see is basically the hit rate of the automation. So if we would have an automation scenario where all bags that have an alarm would get sent to secondary search, that would be the dashed line. And as you can see, especially EDS CB 2 benefit, or that group benefited a lot with IEDs. If we look at bare explosive, the whole on-screen alarm scenario does not look that good. We see that EDS CB does help. It does support screeners. All groups, again, were better than the no automation group. But we also see that screeners did ignore many alarms, especially in the EDS CB1 group where a high false alarm rate was implemented. Screeners probably didn't trust this alarm that much because there were a lot of false alarms and they ignored about half of the correct alarms. So what can we take from this study? I think we should consider that if on-screen alarm resolution is used, screeners should receive specific training for this on-screen alarm resolution. They should get clear instructions what they have to do. They should be aware that bare explosives, for example, look very similar to harmless objects, and that they should consider sending it to secondary search. Where secondary search should use a risk-based approach using explosive trace detection and manual back search to make sure that bare explosive, which is a threat in cabin baggage screening, are also detected. Now, I would like to go a bit into 3D CT technology. 3D CT technology, as you all know, in whole package screening, we have systems for whole package screenings for a few years now. Right now, the implementation for 3D CT technology in cabin baggage screening is going on. It's coming, it's there, it's available, and first airports already have it implemented. So 3D CT systems allow showing a cabin baggage image as a rotatable image. We can rotate it, so if a threat is shown from a difficult view, we can just rotate it and then see the threat from a familiar view. Also, if it's superimposed by other objects, I can just rotate it and see it from a clear view. It gives also the option to do slice or slab images where I can just slice through an image, just like in medical CT technology. And of course, 3D CT technology also features EDS CB, so explosive detection systems, which we know or know from reports are much improved. It allows C3 standards, and we also know that false alarm rates decrease significantly compared to Multiview technology, EDS CB. So we also did a couple of studies for CD and 3D image interpretation. This study was done for hold baggage screeners. We invited hold baggage screeners that were only experienced with 2D imaging, showed them or split them up in two groups, showed them one test with 2D imaging technology and one test with 3D imaging technology. All of the screeners also did some visual cognitive tests, so they had to do tests where they had to mentally rotate images or that tested how fast they could process information or how well they were able to process information in general. And what we've seen in this study, interestingly, is that certain cognitive abilities that we know correlate with 2D imaging technology, like mental rotation, perceptual speed, visual memory. They also in this study correlated with 2D image analysis performance, but it was not related to 3D imaging technology. So for 3D image analysis, we might have a change in requirements for screeners, which could be interesting for the selection of future 3D screeners. So we're currently working on that a little bit more and try to figure out what are the requirements for 3D screeners. We also did another study where we compared performance, screener performance of 2D versus 2D versus 3D whole package screening. This time we had a group of only 2D experienced screeners versus a group of 3D experienced screeners. So we had also a group included in the study that had already worked with 3D imaging technology. And what we see here is that on one hand, so maybe I should explain the graph a bit. On the y-axis or on the x-axis, you see the two groups, 2D screeners versus 3D screeners. On the y-axis, you see detection performance. The white bars is the detection performance for 2D imaging test, and the 3D imaging test is shown in gray bars. So what you can see is the 2D screeners performed pretty much the same for both tests, which is, I think, a good sign. They never had training or anything. They just got this test, saw first-time 3D images, and performed in a similar way as they did on the 2D test. But what is really interesting is that the 3D screeners with 3D experience performed much better than that. So they improved detection for both tests, 2D and 3D imaging. But if you compare the 2D screeners with the 2D performance, as we have currently in most airports in whole package screening, to 3D screeners with 3D imaging technology, we see a really improvement in detection. So we can say 3D imaging is more effective than 2D imaging. What about efficiency? So it always comes to questions, but the decision time is probably longer, and yes, it is. We also looked at reaction times. Here you can see for both groups, again, 2D imaging in white bars, 3D imaging in gray bars, the target absent reaction time, so the reaction times for no threat images, which are, you notice, most bags do not have any threats. So for efficiency, we looked at this reaction times, and what we can see here is clear. On-screen alarm resolution for 3D takes longer than for 2D. So what does this mean for efficiency? And for this, I would like to show you this very nice table. We estimated the efficiency for 2D versus 3D screening. We calculated what the efficiency is if we scan 2,500 bags per hour. So on the right and on the left, you see the scenarios. So 2D screeners with 2D imaging, 2D screeners with 3D imaging, 3D screeners with 2D imaging, and so on. And all of them would screen 1,500 bags per hour. We see the EDS false alarm rate for the 2D imaging. We estimated 35%. We estimated the EDS false alarms for the 3D imaging to 15%. We did this from reports from actual airports that used both of these technologies, which leads us to approval capacity of 975 bags for 2D imaging and 1,275 bags for 3D imaging. So on level 1, we already see an increase of efficiency with 3D imaging of 31%. And now it gets really interesting. So bags sent to visual inspection were 525 for 2D imaging, and only 225 for 3D imaging. So even though the decision time for 3D imaging is higher than with 2D imaging, so 12 versus 8 seconds for 2D screeners, we see that with this increase of efficiency in level 1, we see an efficiency increase in level 2 of 36% with untrained screeners. With trained screeners, trained 3D screeners, we see even a efficiency increase level 2 of 49%. So 3D is not only more effective than 2D whole package screening, it is also more efficient in the end. So a little summary. I think I'm running out of time. 2D versus 3D screening. We have seen computer-based training is very important. Specific training is very important. So if you use multi-view technology, if you use 3D technology, use multi-view and 3D technology simulators. Make screeners confident in using this technology before they use the actual technology. And also show them new threats, show them emerging threats, show them how multi-view and 3D CT technology is working for new threats, and make them really confident to use this technology before they work with it. We also have seen that there's a large transfer from 2D to 3D, at least in whole package screening. We will also research that in cabin baggage screening in the next few years. And we have seen for on-screen alarm resolution, in cabin baggage screening, bare explosives are difficult to detect. If on-screen alarm resolution is used in cabin baggage screening, they need clear instruction and they need on-screen alarm resolution training. For whole package screening, OSAR works. It works well. This is the case because in whole package screening, only fully functional IADs are a threat. And as we have seen in the graph before, for IADs, on-screen alarm resolution works well. So this slide, I don't go into detail, but I just quickly wanted to show you that currently we are working for the implementation of 3D CT for cabin baggage screening. So we try to figure out what are the requirements. We also want to look into different groups of screeners. As Mike also said, there are huge differences in the generations. So we also want to look into that. But we also want to look into virtual reality. How can virtual reality be used for training and for the implementation of 3D CT technology? And then when I look at the time, I should probably stop myself now and give the microphone to Dominic.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Your questions are coming in thick and fast. I don't want to put any pressure on Dominic, but we will have some time for questions at the end, hopefully. So please keep sending them. They're really interesting, and we're hoping to get to as many as we can after Dominic. So over to Dominic. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I will not do it in French, Mike, don't worry. I will be quick, in fact, because I think it's quite interesting, just the presentation before. If I understand correctly, I mean, we need to train our screeners with the 3D softwares, but if we continue to use them with the 2D equipment, in fact, they are better than what we are currently doing. So the question is quite interesting because we've seen quite a lot of developments for the last 15 years, and it's mainly coming from mature states, regions. I mean. Which is really good, but we've seen with the previous speakers that the next 15 years growth or 20 years growth will come from regions where in fact the maturity is not there enough. So if we have mature regions, states having spent 15 years of studies and so on to reach quite a lot of really useful information for the implementation to improve. So the questions we have is to maintain the growth and to preserve, in fact, the ability to travel safely and efficiently, as Mike said. What do we need to do now in terms of maybe changing some of the standards? And again, when we go back to what is the IATA vision there, I mean, when we have to work also on standards, as Adam said, we have some standards within IATA and Airlines, but we need maybe to rethink a little bit of which are the standards which are in place in those regions where we are expecting 40-something growth in the next 15 years. And that's the only common, I would say, tool which is used in those states is, fortunately for this August organization, it's an X-17. And we are now almost, 17 years after the USAP program has been launched, and we still see that in a lot of regions, in a lot of states, even the Annex 17 baseline is not really implemented at a level which will be for us a good level of satisfaction. Maybe for states in the room and for airports in the room, it's quite acceptable to have something which is okay, not that good in nationally speaking. But for an airline, it's really an issue, because when we fly from a state A to state B to state C, then we have to add a lot of additional measures, and then we have to comply with the highest level of rules. And unfortunately, the fact that we don't have a common harmonization and common understanding of what should be done at minimum if we don't raise the bar worldwide, we will be faced to the same current difficulty. But imagine in 15 years' time, if we have twice double, if we double the number of people in that room, if we have to go through the same security systems at airports, entrance of the building, it will be just a huge chaos. And I could understand the new generation saying, oh, at my age, it was really a pleasure to fly. It was really nice. It was really a good experience. But is it a good experience now? And what will be for the future? So the premise is to work, in fact, on another project, document for us, which is, even if it's not, I would say, the most important one for our airlines, because we have IOSA, but still, we need to make sure that the common understanding of basic rules worldwide and in those regions, when we expect a 40-something% growth in the next 15 years, we need to make sure that at least we do understand the same way the basic rules. And one of the basic tools we have is Annex 17, as you know, and we have in our objectives to try to rethink, quite not drastically, but try to rethink the way currently Annex 17 is written, so that to have better, not better in terms of the content, but maybe rules, regulations which are easier to understand, to implement, and to make sure that we all speak the same language. So we have different tools in Annex 17. We could remove something we think is obsolete. We could amend or upgrade some of the recommended practices which were sitting there for many years. We could also amend or create definitions, standards. So that we have quite a lot of different tools. And that has been used for many years, in fact, to introduce piece by piece some of new standards, or to think about removing something or to change something, but not with I would say, an holistic picture. And what we have in mind for our triennium, the 2022 vision, we would like to think per categories. We like to rethink, for example, what are the requirements worldwide for security equipment? What about the trust with the security clause or the collaborative arrangements? How could we make sure that the trust has to be built maybe with more states, so that we avoid the current situation we may have with some states imposing measures because they don't really trust what others are doing? What about all baggage screening? What about differentiated screening? What about staff screening? What about training and certification? And we already mentioned about incident reporting. So in those areas, we try to propose some not totally, we are not rewarding everything, but just per sector, we try to see how could we prepare the 2035 or 2040 growth. How could we maybe prepare those states not having yet implemented satisfactory baseline? How could they do better? How could they understand better? How could they make full use of all the studies which have been done in other regions to make sure that we all implement at minimum the same type of standards? And we also try to develop some maybe new, I would say, some new small tools, like, for example, we would like to have some projects, but it's one example of the projects we have now, is to try to set up new template, new standard for helping some of the stakeholders. As WestJet said, we have a lot of subcontractors, we have a lot of operators, and if we could have some simple tools to help everybody to access information, for example, on training certification, for example, on background checks, for example, I don't know, on anything which could, in fact, where we need information from one airport to another, from an airline to check subcontractors, for authorities even to check what people are doing. We try to develop new products, new tools at IATA, just to give more ability for states and stakeholders to implement basic measures at the proper time. So I will stop there to have the enough questions if you want. So, Mike.
Thank you very much, Dominic, and thank you very much to all of the people on the panel. I hope you found that informative and educational. We're now going to challenge them. That was all pre-scripted. They got to say what they thought and they gave you the answers to the questions they thought you had. We're now going to ask the real questions, the questions that you've been putting forward. In certain areas, there's some generic conversations and questions being put forward, so I'm going to try and lump some together so we can get through as many as possible. So the first question really is for Jared and Matthew. So where do you draw the line between airline security responsibilities and state responsibilities? And sort of following on from that is, how do airlines work more closely with regulators to help form some of those regulations before they appear? So I think we'll start with Jared.
I think that's a really great question. And where do we draw the line between our responsibilities as an airline and state responsibilities? I think states do a very good job about setting a baseline. And the baseline is just merely where we start. But each airline, as part of our operations, we have to be able to assess through risk assessment what vulnerabilities exist within our own operations. A baseline is a very simple place to start. However, we're the ones who are implementing those regulations and those measures. And at the end of the day, that gives us a greater vision into what vulnerabilities we see. And we have the ability to be able to close those vulnerabilities, and we have to be able to assess them capably. We can take that information and we can provide it back to the regulators and identify where they need to focus some attention or what measures might be redundant or obsolete and aren't necessary. And I think it's a constructive relationship between airlines and regulators to try and address that problem. One of the issues that obviously happens with the regulatory system is that they very, very quickly become, or not very quickly, but they can become obsolete. And it takes a long, long time to be able to overhaul regulations in a bureaucratic sense. So industry has the capability to be able to take a leading position on identifying where those evolutions are and how we can work together to be able to solve some of those challenges. Matt, do you want to take one?
I think you covered that pretty well.
Okay, thank you. So question from the audience. Jared and Adam, you gave an interesting explanation about the taxonomy and how that improves in reporting and everything else. So is there training available? Does IATA or possibly WestJet, do you provide training on how to use this new process and this new language?
I'll start again. Security incident reports or occurrence reports are an evolving topic. It changes consistently, and no matter how often we can deliver training or we can try and isolate what challenges are in terms of factual information, how we collect those fields and how we explain what each incident or what occurrence is and what it means by definition is important. So we do include training specifically to our contractors. What we find in a contractor relationship, though, is generally the workers aren't necessarily the ones who are going to be submitting reports through our system. Generally, it'll filter through their leadership. So we have a smaller group to be able to enable the collection of those reports and specifically the information. But the problem you then run into is you have a third person who's providing information to a leader to be able to supplement or fill that report. The standard taxonomy, which we've recently just adopted at WestJet, I'm hoping will be very, very helpful and beneficial, breaking down by descriptors and subcategories. That will give us kind of a more consistent form to be able to be completed. And then we'll be able to enhance training based upon what we're starting to see as the outputs from those reports.
Thank you. So Adam, from an IATA point of view, what is IATA doing to drive that education and awareness and to improve the reporting performance? Do we provide training?
So what we're basically doing is we work around the security culture. We from the IATA perspective, we don't know the specificity of each and every entity to actually, have a silver bullet on how you train, how you submit reports. What we see is that there is a process like the one that was displayed on the presentation, and what we understand from the frontline staff perspective is all about feeling empowered to raise a security issue. It could be on vulnerability, on potential threat, on detected bizarre behavior, or even perhaps the procedure not working good enough from the point of view of the individual reporting. Then there will always, or usually typically, there will be a step to identify, quite similar to Xray images, what are the false positives. So what are the real reports and what are, let's say, no issue reports. So there will be a corporate filter. So recently we focus on the security culture element. So again on IATA website, you may see the videos available in now 10 languages. So we went beyond the 6 official languages of ICAO and the United Nations, and they basically cover the issue of having people the sense of empowerment that they can raise a security issue if they feel concerned that the title is "Say It, Report It." And then we come up with a sort of different guidance material on how the analysis, the further analysis of reports can be done, but then it's more for the airlines or the entities to just select what's most suitable for them in terms of their own environment.
Thank you, Adam. A lot of the questions, as you've probably seen on the app, are anonymous, but credit to the brave who put forward their name. So this is a great question, so I'm going to name check the person that put this forward. So Jeff Moore has raised the question, with the likely explosion in autonomous urban air mobility systems for short-hop passenger transportation over the coming decades, is IATA prepared for the associated requirement for the huge array of new standards, new threats, and even new language that this will bring? So I'm going to start this with Matthew, but if anybody else on the panel wants to come in, because I think this is a great question.
Short answer is yes, very much aware of the developments in the UAM space at the moment. There isn't one OEM out there that currently does not provide airframes to scheduled air carriers that is not looking at UAM. It's also interesting that UAM will ultimately represent an interesting nexus between physical and cybersecurity. And if you talk to the pioneers that were looking at this over 3 or 4 years ago, physical security is not in their plan whatsoever. The pilots that are taking place right now, Sao Paulo, Brazil, Los Angeles, California, the business cases in terms of being able to pay for the infrastructure and buildings to sell platforms and real estate. I think I heard something in Los Angeles, 2.5 days of traffic and the economic consequence of people stuck in traffic. It was something like 9 hours of operation for the UAM. And so the business case for some of these mega cities to adopt UAM is profound, absolutely profound. What is going to be interesting and definitely to the point of the question is how do you then transnationalize that? And so for example, Montreal to New York, I don't know if anyone's tried to fly that sector recently, specifically over the summer period, it's dreadful. Right, the reliability, the scheduling, you could be 24 hours delayed trying to get across 800 kilometers, but UAM offers that, or will ultimately offer a low altitude, reliable line of sight option where they've already built their own air traffic management architecture. They've already got the reservation and passenger system all set up and established. And you board this device where lithium battery has a range of over 8 to 9 hours already today. So yeah, it's on the horizon. We're looking at it. largely through the OEM space.
Does anyone else on the panel want to come in on that question? No? Great answer, nailed by Matthew. Wonderful. So, question for Dominique, with his background and experience. How can airlines work more closely with regulators? And why do you think regulators are potentially hesitant to engage more closely with carriers around the implementation of effective rules and regulations?
Yeah. I don't know if the statement is so correct that regulators are not working with their own airlines. I mean, I see some of the faces smiling there. So I think it's I mean, I was on the regulatory side also in the past, but I think it's as a regulator, you first you need to help at maximum your industry, airports and airlines, and you try to do the best to make sure that they are effective, efficient. I mean, you may have also a lot of political issues sometimes if you have issues at airports or with airlines. So I think regulators, they are really keen in helping their own airlines. The problem might be when you start to have an airline which is not registered by that state, and then we have to negotiate, for example, for security programs, for things like that, approval and so on. It starts to be complicated sometimes. But I think it's the problem is also with maybe states not trusting each other enough to accept what the work done on safety. It's working quite well, but on security, when you have one state approving, for example, a security program, is it recognized by other states? It's not that easy. So I would think it's more a question of lack of trust, effective trust between regulators, which is maybe creating a problems for airlines, but not the discussion, the communication, or the cooperation between national airlines and the entity, the regulators. And we try to build that trust by different means and trying to prove that if someone has done a good job in one state, please, I mean, at least have a look and try to analyze before imposing on airlines something which is maybe already done. So, so trust amongst regulators will probably help a lot the smooth implementation of worldwide measures for airlines.
Thank you. So, question for Sarah. Given a lot of the data that you presented, are we not at the point where machine detection is almost at 100%, and are we in a position where we can say that machines are far more accurate than humans, and at which point does the human drop out of the detection scenario?
That is a very good question. I think the new systems, or what I've heard from trials with 3D CT, cabin baggage screening systems, their EDS CB systems are very, very good. Like, they have very, very high hit rates. They have very, very low false alarm rates. So I think in that scenario, an automated decision makes sense for the primary search, that all bags that are somehow alarmed go immediately to secondary search without a human decision. But I don't think that necessarily means that the human is out of the loop at all, because we still need trained humans to even for secondary search. We do not know what the scenario looks like when primary search is done by automation. I think a secondary search screener still needs to know how an ID looks like, how explosives looks like, like when he opens the bag, he needs to know what's in it, basically. To kind of make a risk assessment, what is the procedure in secondary search. On the other hand, I think we also still need trained humans to kind of supervise the automation. Like, if nobody knows how an ID, how an explosive looks like, how that looks like in an Xray image, how can we manage, how can we supervise an automation? How do we know that it still properly works, that it still does what it's supposed to be? So I think even just for these two cases, humans are still needed. Humans are still in the loop. And I think we should focus more on human automation teaming. So really to see what is the human good at, what is the automation good at, and how can we like make a system out of this and not just one or the other.
Okay, thank you very much. Unusually, there's a question for the moderator, myself. So with about 2 minutes to go, I'm going to take that one, and then I'm going to flip it to Matthew. So the question is about the Blue Skies event that IATA held. And the question is basically, how easy was it for attendees to think outside of their comfort zone? And what do we need to do in events like these to break down some of those historical barriers and those challenges around preconception? We'll be very frank, it was a 2.5-day event, and I would say that the first day was a challenge to get people to think outside the box, to get people to move away from their historical way of thinking, to genuinely embrace that blank sheet of paper. And for me, on a very personal level, the big thing I took away was the generational gap between mindsets. For me, the most powerful message I heard was those millennials, that Generation Z, looking me in the eye and telling me quite categorically that they didn't believe that passenger growth was exponential. They didn't believe that the air cargo was a sustainable position. And they've got very strong views, or the people in the room of that generation had very strong views about how they see the future. They think differently to me. Not surprisingly, I'm in my 50s and they're 18, 19, 20 years of age, but they think very differently from me. They want different things than I do, and they see the world in a very different way. So having them in the room I thought was excellent. Did we have enough of them? Were we able to break those barriers and have a genuine blank sheet of paper? Potentially not, but we've made a start, and I'm going to flip to Matthew, who's going to explain how we're going to drive that forward in the future.
In 34 seconds.
In 34 seconds,
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. So I think the short answer is, Mike, that we will run this again in June next year, probably at the same location, hosted by Eurocontrol. We have Tony Blackerson in the audience, sitting over to the far right. He is an absolute professional at this, has run the original Blue Skies in Hong Kong. He was there a couple of months ago, and will definitely take this forward in 2020. So, look, thanks for your time this afternoon. It's been interesting, and go from there.
Thank you. And if we can show our appreciation for the panel in the usual way, if we thank you again.
And our appreciation to you, Michael, for that last comment about the generational gap, I think is excellent. It was brought up before in the symposium, and it's really something that we need to focus on in the future. Thank you to the panel again, and we're now ready for lunch. Lunch today is sponsored by Westminster Aviation Security Services, and it'll give you an opportunity to see your colleagues who were in the workshops this morning and maybe exchange notes on how it went in the workshop and maybe share some of the ideas that we all learned here this morning. So we'd like to see you back at 10 minutes after 2, and